So let's begin with this Benami Transaction Act. See, the moment we talk about the Benami transaction, let's understand the core. What exactly is a Benami? Why do we say something which is Benami? So if you look about the literal meaning, Benami is something that doesn't have any name, right? So something which is fictitious. So Benami Dar is a person who holds something which is not in a true sense, in a true manner. Okay. So this act was enacted to prohibit all the Benami transactions and a right to recover the properties which are held Benami. So basically, by this act, the government was looking to handle two things. One, anybody and everybody whosoever is holding properties in the Benami names. Like example, many people have done this in the past. Supposedly, if I'm running a company and I've got a lot of properties, I've got a lot of money, so I would be looking to evade tax. So what I will do, I will start buying the properties in the name of my servants, my drivers, all the staff who are working for me. So instead of having everything in my name, I have it in those people's name. So on paper, the property is not mine, but they don't own it. So one was to curb this practice, to reduce this practice. And second, wherever the government gets to know about any Benami property, the government should be able to confiscate that. So the government should be given the right so they can recover those properties. So the Act provides that all the properties which are held Benami will be subject to acquisition by such authority in such manner as may be prescribed. Because only identifying the Benami property doesn't help the situation. Because if I know this property is held Benami, supposedly a maid is working for me and she has a flat. Will it be practically possible for anyone to understand or believe that? No. So we can easily make out that if a maid is having a flat in a posh society, it is difficult for her to own that. So we have identified the property is Benami, but what next? So the Act gives the power to the government, so the government can always acquire, seize those properties. No amount shall be payable for the acquisition of any property which is held Benami. Generally, wherever the government is taking anything from anybody, the government looks to compensate them. Because if I'm talking about developing the infrastructure, roads or constructions, bridges, pools, everywhere, the government generally compensates people. But here for Benami, there will not be anything that will be given in return. The purchase of property by any person in the name of his wife or unmarried daughter for their benefit will not be Benami. Because the moment we talk about this Benami property is mine, but it is, yes, you can ask Tanisha, it is held in somebody else's name. So in that case, what will happen? Are all the properties Benami? Not really. Because if I am having a property in the name of my family, my husband, my daughter, my kids, my parents, that is not Benami. So here the law says it's not only for the male members, it's only for the female members. So if a person is having a property for his wife or an unmarried daughter, then it's not Benami. The security is held by the depositories as registered owners, or they are also the agents, that also will not be Benami. So wherever we're talking about the depositories, practically all the securities are with the depositories only. So they can always hold those properties on behalf of others. And this will not be Benami again. Okay, Tanisha, if you have any doubt now, I would request you leave a chat here. So I can understand and I can answer your question. Okay. Then this Benami Transaction Act of 88 was amended to the Benami Transaction Prohibition Amendment Act of 2016. This amended law empowers the specified authorities to provisionally attach Benami properties, which can eventually be confiscated. So right now we are only attaching the property and gradually we can always confiscate those properties. Besides, if a person is found guilty of an offence of Benami transaction by any competent court, he shall be punishable with a rigorous imprisonment for a term which will not be less than 1 year but up to 7 years, and a fine up to 25% of the fair market value of the property. So here this act has gone little ahead in this amendment, and we can provisionally also attach a property, because earlier the provisional attachment was not there. Till it is proved as Benami, we cannot confiscate. So here we also have a provisional attachment, and with that the rigorous imprisonment is also there. So what is a fair market value? Fair market value is generally a value that any property would fetch in the market, because generally this is how people manipulate the records. If my flat is worth 1 crore rupees, I will always show it as a 50 lakh, 60 lakh flat. So I can save a lot on taxes. So generally government appoints these valuators and they give you a fair value of these properties. How do we prohibit these Benami transactions? So here the section 3 of the act says, no person shall enter into any Benami transactions. Obviously, because the first thing to deter anybody is to stop getting into any Benami transactions. Whosoever does this will be punishable with an imprisonment up to 3 years or fine or with both. So here the law says, primarily nobody should get involved into any of the Benami transactions. If anybody does that, there are penalties available. Then there is a prohibition of right of recovery, property which is held under Benami. So the section 4 says that no suit or a claim or action to enforce any right in respect of any property which is held Benami against the person in whose name the property is held or against any other person shall lie by or on behalf of a person claiming to be the real owner of such property. So here I'll explain it by giving an example. Supposedly one property is held by Mr. X. It is shown in the record that Mr. X is the owner. But if I go through the income records of Mr. X, I can easily make out that Mr. X cannot afford this property. So what government will do? Government will provisionally attach the property or confiscate the property ultimately if they can prove it. Once the property is confiscated or attached, maybe Mr. X or Mr. Y, who is the true owner, cannot raise any objection, cannot file any case against this. Because if it is a Benami property, then there is absolute no relief which is applicable. Right? So even if Mr. X would say, this property was taken by Mr. Y to be gifted to me in future for this or something that, then it will not be heard. Because in the law, the exemptions are given only to a wife and unmarried daughter. Otherwise, if it's proved that the person in whose name the property is held is not the true owner, then it will be a Benami property only. Then section 4 subsection 2 says that there is no defense which is available for any rights in respect of any property which is held Benami, whether against the person in whose name the property is held or against any other person. So no suit, no claim, no action, nothing will be entertained by the true owner or any person on behalf of them. Then the section 5 of the act says any property which is the subject matter of the Benami transaction will be liable to be confiscated by the central government. So obviously the property which we are talking about, the property in question, if proved as Benami, that will always be confiscated by the central government. Then the section 6 says that any person being a Benamidar is a person who has a property in a fictitious name, shall not retransfer the Benami property held by him to the beneficial owner or any other person acting on his behalf. So what this says, supposedly Mr. X gets to know that government might take some action against me, or he receives a notice for his property. So after that he cannot transfer the property to Mr. Y, who is a true owner, or any other person. Because if the property was Benami, the transaction was Benami, then you cannot retransfer the property back to the person saying, now I want to give it back. Because again, this will not be entertained. This is not allowed in law. Then section 24 talks about the notice and the attachments of the property which are involved in this Benami transactions. So here the section says that wherever any initiating officer, on the basis of the material in his possession, whatever are the evidences, records in his possessions, he has a reason to believe that any person is a Benamidar person for that particular property. Then after recording the reasons in writing, he can issue a notice to such person to show cause within such time as may be specified to prove that the property is not Benami. So wherever any officer has any information about the property, he gets some proofs, some materials, some records, and he has a reasonable reason to believe that this is a Benami property. So what we do, we go by the rule of natural justice. So the person will record the reasons in writing and ask the person to submit in writing that why the property should not be treated as a Benami property. So that is, a chance of defense should be given to the person, opportunity of being heard. And the subsection 3 says, wherever the initiating officer is of the opinion that the person in possession of the property may alienate such property. Alienating the property is giving it away to somebody else. Okay, parting off with the property during the period specified in the notice. Then he may, with the previous approval of the approving authority, by order in writing, attach such property. Because supposedly, if the officer is coming to my house and they're giving me a notice that this flat is not in your name and it is in somebody else's name, and we feel this is a Benami property. So you give us we are giving you 15 days time to reply back to us that this property is not a Benami property. And I know it's a Benami property. So what I will do, first thing I will do is, I will try to sell off the property to somebody else. So here the law has this provision that wherever the officer feels the property might be alienated, the officer can always attach the property. Then the subsection 4 also says that wherever the initiating officer, after making inquiries and collecting evidences, if he deems fit, considering all the information, within a period of 90 days can pass an order. So whoever is the initiating officer, after collecting all the informations and evidences, should revert within 90 days, should pass an order about the property, whether it's a Benami or not. Then section 25 deals with the procedure of serving a notice. So here the law says, a notice may be served on a person named therein either by a post or as if it was summoned by a court under the Code of Civil Procedure. So how the notice will be served? In the same manner as a normal court notices are served, or it can also be served by a post. And the guidelines are available under the Code of Civil Procedure. How do we adjudicate this property? So the section 26 deals with this adjudication. Here they say the adjudicating authority can issue a notice to furnish the documents, records, particulars, evidences as it considers necessary on a date to be specified therein. So whosoever is the adjudicating authority will be asking for all the informations, records and evidences, whatever is considered necessary for that specified matter. How do we confiscate and vest this Benami property? So the section 27 deals with confiscation and wasting. Wherever there is an order which is passed in respect of any property under section 26, holding the property to be a Benami property, the adjudicating authority, after giving opportunity of being heard to the person concerned, make an order of confiscation of that Benami property. So here we always go by the rule of natural justice. So whosoever is found to be guilty should always be given an opportunity of being heard. So he should be given a chance to defend himself. Wherever there is an appeal which is filed against such order of the adjudicating officer, the law does not say whatever the officer is saying is true. The person always has a chance of making an appeal. If he feels his property is his own property and there is nothing which is Benami, there is nothing which is illegal, he can always refer an appeal to the appellate tribunal under the section 46. And then onwards, the confiscation will be done as per the procedure which are prescribed by the appellate tribunal. Then the section 28 deals with the management of properties which are confiscated. So what will happen when the government is confiscating so many properties? So the government can always appoint the administrator. So the administrator has this power to receive. Okay, see, wherever the property is confiscated, wherever the government receives the information on its own, or someone complains about the information, wherever they were investigating about the properties. Because after the Modi government came in 2016, he actually started this drive. So they actually went and checked all the records of the property transactions which were done. So sometime on their own they get to know about a property, or sometime they receive some complaints from somebody that this property is a Benami property. So that's how they start investigating. Okay. So it says the administrator will have a power to receive and manage the property, because ultimately if we have received the property, it should be maintained properly, right? We cannot deteriorate the property. So the administrator will receive and manage those properties as per the provisions given under the Act. It is started by the initiating officers. Initiating officers are the one who are conducting the inquiry, they're taking up the matter. Then when all the informations are collected, they put it to the adjudicating officers. Then adjudicating, see, who is the adjudicator? Adjudicator is a person who disposes of the matter, who handles the matter, who takes the matter in his own hand. Okay. So initiating officer gets all the information, it is given to the adjudicating authority. And if I am not happy with the decision of the adjudicating authority, I can always refer an appeal to the appellate tribunal. Okay. Then section 29 deals with the possession of the property. So wherever any order of confiscation has been passed, the administrator will proceed to take the possession of the property. That we have already seen. It is the administrator who has a right to receive and manage the properties. Then there are provisions for appellate tribunal. So the section 30 deals with establishment of this appellate tribunal. The section seeks to provide the central government shall by notification establish an appellate tribunal. And what this appellate tribunal will be doing? Primarily, hear all the appeals against the orders which are passed by the adjudicating authority and any other authority under this act. Then section 40 deals with the procedures and powers of this appellate tribunal. So if I am talking about this appellate tribunal, there also we look to rely on the Code of Civil Procedure and the principles of natural justice. So both the parties should be given an opportunity of being heard, and then only any judgment should be given by the authority. And this appellate tribunal judgment will be as good as judgment given by any civil court. So it should be adhered in a similar manner. From this appellate tribunal, we have provision to appeal to High Court. See, from adjudicating authority, we went to the appellate tribunal. From appellate tribunal, we can go to the High Court. Okay, so there is a hierarchy in the law mechanism. Then section 49 deals with the appeal to a High Court. In this section, the law says any party who is aggrieved by the decision of the appellate tribunal can always refer an appeal to the High Court. And this appeal should be made within 60 days time from the decision of the appellate tribunal. And this appeal is generally only on a question of law and never on question of fact. Because if I'm talking about the facts, I cannot say earlier I gave you this, I forgot to mention this. I can only say whatever was given, all the evidences remain the same, but my question of law is not clear. I feel justice is not given based on law, because I cannot go on adding the facts. Okay, so the appeals are always on the question of law and never on facts. Then there is a provision of establishing a special courts also. So the section 50 deals with the establishment of special courts. So wherever the central government feels, in consultation with the Chief Justice of the High Court, can always designate one or more courts of sessions as a special court for a particular area or particular class of people, wherever the offences are punishable under this act. So here the government says, obviously the central government, in line with the Chief Justice of High Court, can always appoint some of the session courts only as a special court to handle the matters of this act. How do we handle the offences and what are the ways of prosecutions? So here the section 53 deals with the penalties. That wherever any person enters into a Bainami transaction, he is defeating the provisions of any law or avoiding any payment of any statutory dues or avoiding any payment to the creditors. Sometimes what people do, supposedly if I have a lot of properties and I have got a lot of debt also, but I don't want to pay my debt. So what I will do, I will keep transferring my properties. So ultimately I will declare myself as insolvent and I will not pay any of my liabilities. So sometimes people do this also to evade the tax liability or the loans. The Bainamidar himself or any other person who is helping the person, who is abating or inducing any person for such Bainami transactions will be guilty of the offence of this Bainami transactions. So here the law is very clear. Whoever is holding any property in any wrongful manner or evasion of any liabilities will be held responsible and will be guilty of offence under this Bainami Act. Then section 62 deals with the provision for companies. In case of companies, wherever any person is committing a contravention of any provisions of this act, any rule, any directions, any order, and the and thereunder it is a company. So if, because we are aware company is also legal person, so wherever the default is by any company, every person who at the time of contravention was in charge and responsible for the company will be responsible for the conduct of this practice. So he will be he will be guilty for contravention and will be held liable for the punishment. Because obviously if I'm talking about the companies, we cannot punish company literally. Company being a legal person, the fine can be paid by the company account, but imprisonment has to be a human person. Okay, so with this, I'm done with this topic. Let's start with the second one, prevention of money laundering. The moment we talk about a money laundering, this is a very core concern. Generally, they are in almost every segment. Because the moment we talk about a money laundering, this is a big task. Even the governments are facing everywhere. People come up with the illegal money or unaccounted money, and they introduce the money in the system. And after some time, it gets difficult for us to ascertain whether the money is a right year's money or a wrong money. So literally, money laundering is what? Washing your blacks. Money is washed out. So all the illegality of the money is washed out, removed, and the money is treated as a legal money. Okay, so this is basically a process of criminal proceedings to disguise the illegal origin of money. The most common areas of money laundering is terrorism, illegal arms, financial crimes, smugglings, some of the organized crimes, drug trafficking, prostitutions. These generally generate huge sums. They are obviously lucrative. They give you a lot of money, and obviously this is the most illegal aspect. Embezzlements, insider tradings, briberies, computer frauds, they also give you a lot of profits. And this only creates a incentive to all the to legitimize all these ill-gotten gains. See, supposedly if I am a person who's good in hacking or good in smuggling, I've got contacts, so I will be earning a lot of money. But what will I do with that money? Somewhere I will have to use it in a legal manner, right? So I need to put it into a system where I can use that money. Okay, so generally this is the incentive people have. So what they do, a lot of black money is introduced in the system, and they use it in such a manner that the origin of illegal is removed from that. Okay. Wherever a criminal activity generates substantial profits, the individual or the group who are involved in such activity route the funds to the safe havens by disguising the sources, changing the form of the money, moving the funds to a place where they are less likely to attract the attention. See, if I'm talking about this money laundering, I think in India specifically, everybody must have heard about the Swiss accounts. A lot of people had, and the Modi government, and a lot of people were really after that, we need to get access to all those Swiss account holders' names and details, so we can actually ascertain whether the money is a legitimate money or not. So a lot of efforts were done by the government also towards that, and a lot of people were also raising a lot of questions here and there. So this is how generally people do that. They earn money from one place and they put it in some other place. So it is difficult for us to track the money. What is the process of this money laundering? If it sounds so easy, it sounds so simple, but is it really that simple? Because anything illegal, maybe it's looking lucrative, easy, but it is really very dangerous, right? So it always has a lot of problems attached to it, and ultimately any wrongdoing should never be promoted. So here they are giving us a fair idea of how this money laundering is done. So it has 3 steps. One is a placement step, where the money is placed in the market. Then what we do, we start layering the money. What is the layering the money? We start doing a lot of transactions with this money. So from one place to another, then third, fourth, fifth. So we start layering the money, and finally we integrate this in the system. So integration is a place wherein they lose the origin. In the initial or the placement stage, the launderer introduces his illegal profit into the financial system by breaking up the large sums of amount into the less conspicuous amounts, smaller sums. Those are generally deposited into the bank accounts, or by purchasing a series of some monetary instruments. Those are later collected and deposited into accounts at some another location. So how generally people do this? They have got a lot of illegal money. They put it into a small denominations, so they don't catch the attention of the person or the government. In the layering stage, the launderer, the person who's doing this money laundering, engages in a series of conversions or movements of his funds to distance them from the source. The funds might be channeled through the purchase and sale of investment instruments, or the launderer might simply wire the funds to a series of accounts at various banks across the globe. So this is layering stage. I want to create some layers of the money, so people don't get to reach the origin. So I'm putting into different accounts, different countries, different locations, different businesses, and ultimately I want to lose the track of originality. See, this is what happens with us also. I'll tell you my own experience. In my own, nowadays, any which way, social media is helping us a lot, but creating a lot of problems also. A lot of rumors, a lot of wrong information is also circulated. Once I receive information on a group that somebody is in dire need of some blood or some money, and they are into hospital and dying, they need some help, so contact on this number and provide some help. That they are actually called on the number, and the person said, this is my number and I'm living happily here in my house, a senior citizen, and he's like, nobody is in my family even hospitalized. And when I wanted to go back and track the source of the message, I actually could not reach back. Because how many groups you will go back and ask people to forward to the same person who had forwarded? It actually did not reach the origin, the source. So this is what the money launderer does in the layering stage. After successful processing of this criminal profits through the first two phases of money laundering, the launderer moves them into the integration then. In this stage, the fund re-enters the legitimate economy. Now this is my integration stage. I have lost the origin. Nobody can go back and track the origin. So now I want to make it a legitimate money. So I come back in the market in a legitimate manner. The launderer might choose to invest the funds into the real estate, luxury assets, business ventures, films, media. These are the most common areas. This restaurants, business, eateries. These are the most common ventures in which generally these money launderers venture into. If money laundering is so much there, sometimes people feel even if they're doing this money laundering, ultimately we get some money in our economy. So what is the problem? Why are we so bothered? Let people do whatever they're doing. In our economy, we're getting some money. Is that really so? Is it a good thing for us? Economies with growing or developing financial centers, but they have some inadequate control, are particularly more vulnerable to this money laundering as against the established financial centric countries. Obviously, if I'm talking about the countries which are less developed, which do not have proper controls, they will be more vulnerable. If I'm talking about the situation of India, maybe few years back, we could say the same thing for us also. We were also really easily targeted by so many people, so many scams every now and then happening with us. People calling us, fooling us, and getting away with the money. Gradually we are also moving in a better manner. And if we compare ourselves with the economies of US or UK, in those countries it is all the more difficult to introduce such money laundering. So all those places which are more vulnerable, which are generally targeted, they implement comprehensive anti-money laundering regimes, because all the established financial center, first thing they working on this anti-money laundering regimes. They want to ensure that there is no illegal money entering the system, right? Through the process of money laundering, organized crime can infiltrate financial institutions, acquire control of the large sectors of the economy through the investments. They offer bribes to those public officials and the governments also. Thus, this economic and political influence of criminal organizations can weaken the social fabric, ethical standards, and ultimately the democratic institution of society. Okay, so I'll explain this once again. If I'm talking about the money laundering, ultimately we get money in our economy. So why are we so bothered? We should welcome that, because money is a money ultimately. So as a country like India, we are still developing. So we want funds to manage things, right? So what is the problem of this money laundering? They generally catch hold of those large segments. Because if I'm talking about a money laundering, if they're investing in my company, we're not investing in 1, 2 shares. They will be investing in my 10-20% of shares. So looking to get control over the economy. And with that huge money, they generally look to bribe the public officers, influence the governments, and this is how they are impacting adversely to our economy and politics. And this ultimately weakens the ethical standards. Why in India every now and then we are talking so much about this politics in everywhere? If I'm talking about this lockdown situation today also, everywhere we will see some or the other thread of politics involved. At this time of crisis wherein people are dying of this disease, the world at large is disturbed. But we Indians are still busy in our politics of Hindu Muslim. So somewhere it is, these things are so deep rooted in us, we cannot go beyond and think of anything else but this. Today morning I saw some people posting on Facebook and Instagram that, will Modi continue after 2024? And I was shocked. We are not even sure about this 2020 and people are planning for 2024. And first, what thing? Whether Modi will continue or not. At this time, this is a life-saving time. We need to be worried about our own lives. But people are thinking so much about this Modi. Somebody will support him, somebody will be against him. But going beyond, we will not work. So this is the impact of money laundering. They influence people so deeply and it weakens the democracy ultimately. Because what should happen will not happen. People, political parties, companies, they are biased because they are under their influence, they are under their control. Because with that huge money, they're trying to dominate the will. So if this is a problem, what shall we do? And is this problem only with India? This is the problem with world at large. So let's look at some of the global initiatives. Money laundering is an international phenomenon, obviously. So here we would say the best way to handle this money laundering is have a cooperation among all the countries. So the United Nations or the Bank for International Settlements took some initiatives in the year 1980 to address this problem of money laundering. And they created this Financial Action Task Force in 89, FATF. Regional groupings such as European Union, we have Councils of Europe, Organization of American States, they also established their anti-money laundering standards for their member countries. Because if I'm talking about the money laundering, we need to be aware that this is a problem in the world at large. So we need to do something to fight this at world at large. So a lot of initiatives were taken by different clusters. One of them is a Vienna Convention. These treaties and these conventions are generally for world at large. So whosoever is a signatory countries, all the countries who are signing these conventions, they generally are bound by it legally. So whosoever is a country which is signing a convention, they are supposed to change their laws, change their rules to adapt to these convention content. So in this Vienna Convention also, it created a groundwork for efforts to combat this money laundering, to curb this money laundering by obliging the member states to criminalize the laundering of money from drug trafficking. So whoever is into this drug trafficking, we need to start criminalizing these activities. So all the members had this obligation to criminalize this activity because many places, many countries do not take drugs as a wrong thing. It is not a crime. In India, we say taking drugs is a crime. Many places it would not be. Right? So the Vienna Convention put this obligation on the countries that you need to start putting another criminal offense. It also promotes the international cooperation in investigation and making extradition between the member states applicable to money laundering. The best example I think we all witnessed in last few years, the moment we talk about all the defaulters, whoever, like if I'm talking about the Vijay Mallya or the Nirav Modi, these people, they fled from India. So what are we looking? We are looking for cooperation from those countries. That whoever is our defaulter should be given to us. And the same thing has been happening since ages for all these underworld people also. So, we have been requesting all the countries to hand over our culprits to us so we can take proper action against them. So in this convention, people created a groundwork for having a harmony among the states. All the countries should cooperate among each other for the investigations and extradition wherever required. The convention also establishes a principle that domestic bank secrecy provisions should not interfere with international criminal investigations. See, when I'm talking about the Swiss bank accounts, the first reply from the Swiss bank was, we cannot share the confidential information of our account holders. And that's with everybody. No bank will share any information of the account holder with anybody. But some of these treaties and conventions only created a groundwork that wherever it's about some international criminal investigations, the secrecy should not hinder the process. Secrecy should not disturb the process. Then we have this Council of Europe Convention. The Council of Europe Convention on this money laundering, search and seizure and confiscation of the proceeds of crime 1990 also establishes a common policy on this money laundering. So after 88, again in 90, we had this convention. One of the purpose of the convention is to facilitate the international cooperation, because this is the biggest challenge. In my country, if I'm sitting here and I know my neighbor who's working, who's doing some business by some illegitimate means, and he's got a lot of money, and I know, being a neighbor, that he transfers his money to abroad, some country, some place, he buys properties there, he has got some, investments there. How will we check it? How will we prove it? It's difficult, right? So till we have international cooperation, it will be difficult for us to move ahead with any investigations, with any search and seizure operations. So wherever the crimes are, like drug offense, arms dealing, terror attacks, all these, they have large profits, and because of which we are looking for international cooperation, because these are generally not managed under one country. They generally have a cross-border operations. Then European Union money laundering directives. Then we have these directives also given by this European Union in response to the new opportunities for money laundering opened up by the liberalization of capital movements. Because the moment we're talking about these era of 90s, we were looking to have more of a liberal trade policies for the world at large. So this also created a threat of money laundering. The more of the liberalization, the problem will always be great. So with this more liberalization policies, the concern was wherever there are cross-border movements of money, this will again lead to a lot of money laundering transactions. So here the Council of European Committees issued directives for prevention of use of financial systems for the purpose of this money laundering. Just 1 minute, Tanisha. Let me ask the admin also. Okay, perfect. So if I'm talking about this money laundering, the world at large is also doing constantly efforts, because wherever we're talking about the era of 90s, we have seen a lot of liberalization in the trade. So a lot of countries were promoting this cross-border transactions. So because of which a need was felt that wherever there are cross-border movements of funds, it might lead to a lot of money laundering activities. So the Council of European Communities issued directives for the prevention of these usage of financial systems for the purpose of money laundering. So we need to minimize the effect of this money laundering. The financial institutes are also required to report any suspicious transactions and ensure that such reporting do not result in any liability for the institution or its employees. See, here I'll give you a very small example. I have an account with a cooperative bank. In that bank, generally, it is more of a family like, because all of my family have account there only and we live in the vicinity only. So at one point, what happened? Our family was going through some problems. So, a lot of people, 3-4 of the family members went to the branch to take away our FDs, whatever the fixed deposits we had with the bank. And we were looking to break those fixed deposits because we were in need of some money. So, 3-4 people from the family visited the branch and we were looking to get our FDs broken. We were looking for instant money. I will tell you, I really appreciate bank for this till date. The bank, the staff reported this to the manager, and you will not believe the manager personally called my father and he asked him if everything is all right or shall he report it to the police, because maybe we are under some pressure, some threat, some problem, so all of the family members are withdrawing the money. So this is the generally the government expects from financial institution. Wherever they see there is something which is suspicious, something which is not in the pattern, so it should be reported, and it should be reported in such a manner that they are under no liability. Because supposedly, if the bank might directly inform the police that this family is taking away all the money, maybe there is some problem, some issue, and there was actually no problem. We were under some financial difficulty, and if the police comes to my place, then I will obviously take action against that bank manager only. So here the directive says we need to inform all the suspicious transactions, but in such a manner that it does not bring any liability for that particular financial institute or any of its employees. Then there are Basel Committee's principles. So in December 88, the Basel Committee on Banking Regulations, Supervisory Practices issued a statement of principles which has to be complied by all the international banks of the member states. These principles covers the identifying customers, avoiding suspicious transactions, and cooperation with the law enforcement agencies. So this Basel Committee focused more on this KYC, and any of the suspicious transactions should be reported, and we need to cooperate with all these law enforcement agencies. Then there are international organizations of Securities Commission, which adopted in October 92 a resolution which encourages its members to take necessary steps to combat this money laundering in securities and futures market. Because if I'm talking about the money laundering, it is not only in our financial market banks, but it is also in the securities market. So securities, futures, options, mutual funds, they are also prone to it. So here they issued a guideline that all the members should take necessary steps to avoid any of these money laundering activities. Then let's have a look at this Financial Action Task Force, the main international body which is engaged in the continuous and comprehensive effort to define policy, promote the adoption of countermeasures against this money laundering is FATF, Financial Action Task Force. It was established to examine the problem of money laundering, and it also made 40 recommendations to curb the problem of this money laundering. So how do we handle this problem of money laundering? So a lot of guidelines are given by this FATF. So there are certain recommendations which I am covering here. Declaration of laundering of monies carried through the serious crimes, a criminal offence. Wherever money is coming through any of the criminal activities, we need to report that. Working out modalities of disclosure by financial institutions regarding reportable transactions. If I say the bank should report all the suspicious transactions, but what is the mechanism? How will the bank report any suspicious transactions? Can they simply go and make a police complaint, or they need to inform the RBI first? What has to be done? So they need to have some methodology for that. Confiscation of the proceeds of crime. How do we confiscate? How do we acquire those proceeds which are involved in the crime? The money of the crime. Declaring money laundering to be an extraditable offence. Because if I'm talking about the money laundering, this has to be a heinous crime. Promoting international cooperation in investigation of this money laundering. Because not only in one particular country, this is a cross-border problem. So we need to have an international cooperation for this money laundering problem. Then we have a provision from this Office of the Drugs Control and Crime Prevention. Talk about this program against the money laundering with a view to increase the effectiveness of the international action against money laundering through some comprehensive technical cooperation services which are offered to the governments. See, initially, if I remember, I'll tell you, somewhere almost 10-12 years back, if I had to go to the bank and deposit money, I could deposit any amount. It's a 50,000 or 1 lakh or 2 lakh. Nobody was bothered. I did not have to submit anything. I simply went, deposited the money, I took out the money. But gradually, this is all reported. So if I want to deposit anything more than 50, I need to give my PAN card. If I want to withdraw more than 50, I need to give my PAN card. So for deposits, withdrawal everywhere, my PAN card is required. Now, with the revised rules, everywhere we are looking to work more on this platform of banking only. So we are looking to demotivate the usage of cash. So everything has to be reported. So whatever is money is deposited, withdrawal, whatever are the payments done, I need to make all the payments through my bank account only. Then and only then I can claim it under the income tax. Otherwise, the government will not give me any benefit. So here or everywhere we will see whatever are the guidelines, directions given, they generally look to understand how do we increase the effectiveness. What are the actions, what are the guidelines that should be taken care. So we are looking to curb this problem of money laundering. And here we are looking to get help from the technical cooperation also. Because the technology also creates a lot of ease in the life of people. Then after seeing the world initiatives, let's have a look at the India initiatives. In the view of an urgent need for the enactment of a comprehensive legislation for preventing the money laundering and all the connected activities, quantification of crime, proceeds of crime, setting up of agencies, mechanism for coordination, measures for combating money laundering, etc., etc. Finally, we had this Prevention of Money Laundering Bill of 1998. And the act finally came into force in 1st July 2005. The section 3 of the act says, whoever acquires, owns, possesses or transfers any proceeds of crimes or knowingly enters into any transaction which is related to the proceeds of crime, directly or indirectly, or conceals or helps in concealment of proceeds of crime, will be guilty of offence of money laundering. So here the law says whoever himself or helps anybody in any of these money laundering activities will be held guilty for this money laundering. Then there are provisions for attachment of properties. Wherever the director or any officer who is not below the rank of a deputy director authorized by him has a reason to believe on the basis of material in his possession that any person is in possession of any proceeds of money laundering. So wherever any officer has a reason to believe, maybe he's got some information, some facts, some records, he has a reason to believe that a particular person is in possession of the proceeds of money laundering, he can always charge such a person for committing a scheduled offence, and proceeds of such crime are likely to be concealed or transferred or dealt in any manner which may result in frustrating any proceedings which will be related to the confiscation of these proceeds. Supposedly, an officer has a reason to believe that a particular person is in possession of proceeds of money laundering, and he feels this money will be alienated. He might just transfer the money, he might just do something, conceal the money, he might just get away with the money. So in that case, such officer may by order in writing provisionally attach such property, and this attachment can be done for up to 90 days from the date of order. So wherever anybody feels that a particular person is in possession of proceeds of money laundering and he has a reason to believe that this will be alienated, he can always confiscate, he can always provisionally attach and gradually confiscate it if proved right. Then section 6 empowers the central government to appoint by notification one or more person who will not be below the rank of a joint secretary to the government as the adjudicating authority to exercise jurisdiction, powers and all the authorities which are conferred under this act. So here again the central government has a power, they can appoint anybody to act as an adjudicating officer. Then what are the obligations of these banking company, financial institutions and all these intermediaries which are working in this financial capital market? So here the section chapter 4 of the act deals with obligation of all these banking companies, financial institutes and intermediaries. Because the moment we're talking about these guidelines, we can always see the difference in our own practice. I'll tell you, if I am talking about my own self, initially I don't even remember when we had last done the KYC. But since few years now, every year the banks are asking us to submit the KYC records. It's good in a manner. Sometimes we feel we are disturbed, we are hassled, it's a problem. Why everywhere we are submitting? But that's actually good in a manner, no? So we are looking to get away with any of these Benami transactions. Supposedly, if I open an account in somebody's name and the person is no more with me and I continue using the account. So if every year I have to submit the KYC, I will ensure that whoever is the true owner is there with that property. Right? So many times we feel it's a hassle, it's a problem, submitting the KYCs, giving PAN card for everything, submitting, so much of procedure to follow. But in a way, it's good. So all these banking company, financial institutes, and all these intermediaries need to maintain a record of all the transactions. What is the nature of these transactions, value of these transactions, and sometimes the values are prescribed. Now for us, if I'm talking about the banks needs to report all the transactions which are above 50,000. Below that, they are not really bothered. But anything below above 50, they need to report it. Whether such transactions comprise of a single transaction or there is a series of transactions which are legally connected to each other. Supposedly now I know that bank will report to transactions above 50,000. So what I do? Maybe every day I go and transfer 25,000, 25,000, 25,000. So that is the case. The bank has a reason to have good suspicion on my transactions also. Because wherever these transactions are taking place within a 1 month time. So the bank can always raise a concern for the same. Then section 16 empowers the authorities to enter wherever they have a reason to believe that an offence has been committed, any place within the limits of the areas assigned to them. So whatever is the jurisdiction given to the authorities, they can always enter any premise for any search, seizures and issuing summons. Then section 23 deals with the presumptions in the interconnected transactions. Wherever there is a money laundering and it involves more than 2 transactions or one or more of such transactions are proved to be involved in some money laundering. Supposedly I am doing a series of transactions. So may not be all the transactions are of money laundering, but maybe 1 or 2 are. Then for the purpose of adjudication or confiscation, under section 8, it will be presumed that the remaining transactions also form part of such interconnected transactions unless it is proved otherwise. Because obviously for the authority they need to assume this. Maybe there are a series of 4 transactions I have done and only one transaction they could prove that yes, this is a money laundering transaction. I am looking to layer or integrate my money in a illegal money here. They can only prove it for one transaction. So here the law says they have an authority to assume for all the other 3 transactions also till it is otherwise proved. Then again here also we have a provision for appellate tribunal. So wherever anybody who is aggrieved with the decision given by the adjudicating officer, they can always prefer an appeal to the appellate tribunal. Again, wherever the order is given by an appellate tribunal, whoever is aggrieved with the decision given by the appellate tribunal can always refer an appeal to the High Court. And to refer an appeal to the High Court, we need to do the same within the period of 60 days. Then we'll see offences are cognizable and these are not bailable. So here the section 45 says that every offence which is punishable under this act will be cognizable. And it says that notwithstanding anything under the Code of Criminal Procedure, anybody who is accused of an offence which is punishable for a term of imprisonment of more than 3 years will not be released on bail or on his own bond unless the public prosecutor has been given an opportunity to oppose the application for such release. Because these are cognizable offences and it should not be bailable. So wherever anybody is held responsible is punishable for a term of more than 3 years, in that case here the schedule says the person should not be released on bail unless the public prosecutor has been given a chance to oppose the same release. Wherever the public prosecutor opposes the application for release, unless the court is satisfied that there are reasonable grounds to believe that he is not guilty of the offence and he will not commit any offence also if he is out on the bail, then and only then the court should grant a bail. Otherwise, these offences are generally cognizable and non-bailable. Then section 58 says, wherever a letter of request is received by the central government from a court or any authority in contracting state requesting for investigation into offence or proceeding under the act and forwarding to such court or authority any evidence which is connected therewith, the central government may forward the same letter of request to the special court or any authority as it thinks fit for execution of such request, and this should be as per the provisions of Act or any law which is time being in force. So here the Act says wherever anybody is making some request to the central government, the government can always decide, the government can always appoint a special court or any authority to take the cognizance of the matter. Then we have certain KYC guidelines. The objective of KYC is know your customers, is to prevent banks from being used intentionally or unintentionally by criminal elements for money laundering activities. So this is what generally people are doing this. Because in my practice also I've heard so many times, so many people come to us being legal practitioners and they come up with their stories, their problems. So they say somebody came to me and he said deposit this money in your account and withdraw it after a few days or so and I will give you this money, that money. So what is this? This is nothing but just putting your black money into white system. What is the obligation on the banks for this KYC? The banks should keep in the mind that whatever is the information collected from the customers for the purpose of opening up the account, it should be treated as confidential and the details are not to be divulged for cross-selling or any other life purposes. See, even if we have these guidelines, but I'm really sorry to say, I don't think so this is followed in India. Because the moment you open a bank account with any of the banks, you are flooded with the phone calls for the loans and the credit cards and all possible irritations. So even if the law says, I don't think so we are following it that properly. So the banks are generally bound to keep this information very, very confidential. Because now if I'm opening account, I need to give them lot of my personal information, lot of my personal records. So that should never be mishandled. The banks should ensure that any remittance of funds for value of more than 50,000 rupees and above is affected by a debit to a customer's account or against any check and not against any cash payment. So wherever the bank is giving any money, if it is more than 50,000, it should always be given against a check only and there should not be any cash payment. Banks should ensure that the provisions of Foreign Contribution Act as amended from time to time are also adhered to. Because whenever people are exchanging money in the forex, then also this rule will apply. What is the KYC policies? Banks should have proper KYC policies which should have all these four elements. What is the customer acceptance policy, customer identification procedure, monitoring all the transactions, and finally my risk management. In the recent past, we have seen few of the banks, they did not do well, and because of which a lot of people's money was at stake. So people were saying the moment we open an account and we submit the KYC to the bank, even we need to have a fair idea about the bank's risk management analysis. So this is what people were talking about. That if I'm giving my money to the bank, I need to have some surety that this money will be given back to me whenever I need it. Right? So basically from the government perspective, the law perspective, the KYC policy should have the customer acceptance policy, that yes, I have read the terms and I say yes, I accept the policy. My identification procedure, transactions should be monitored, and ultimately the risk assessment, risk management. Banks should also pay some special attention to any money laundering threats that may arise from the new or the developing technologies. Internet banking that might favor some anonymities. This we have, I think, reasonably witnessed that. Every now and then we hear of so many such frauds and scams where people's money is taken from their account by some illegal ways and means. So the banks should take proper measures to prevent their use in the money laundering schemes. Because of which banks generally have this OTP system. They send the passwords, in a confidential manner, and they never send a debit card or credit card with the password, with the OTPs. They are also taking a lot of measures. Many banks are engaged in the business of issuing a variety of electronic cards. Those are used by the customers. Every now and then we are seeing to lure the customers, banks are giving so many benefits to the customers. So ultimately they need to ensure that with these benefits there should not be any threat to the customers. Then all the information needs to be preserved by the banks. So the banks have to maintain all the necessary information in respect of transactions to permit the reconstruction of individual transactions, including what is the nature of transaction, the amount of transaction, what was the currency which was involved, the date of transaction, and who are the parties to transaction. So here we can always reconstruct that. So in case If need be, we can always go back and track the transaction. So this information should be reported. And finally, here they say the banks should keep informing the Financial Intelligence Unit from time to time. All the information related to the cash and suspicious transactions and any other transactions which involves receipt by the non-profit organizations of value more than rupees 10 lakh or its equivalent in the foreign currency. And this should be reported to the Director of Financial Intelligence Unit of India. So here the PMLA rule says the banks should also act aggressively and report all the suspicious transactions and cash transactions beyond a particular limit to the director. And if I'm talking about the NGOs, wherever they're receiving more than 10 lakh rupees in Indian currency or any foreign currency, even that should be reported, because ultimately NGOs are not for profits.